can all right. What's up, world? My name is Corey Stay Trapping with Trap Talks, where we discuss the intersection of culture and tech. And today I have the privilege and honor of interviewing DJ or DeJarius James. Did I pronounce that right?
No.
DeJarius. Okay, correct, because we can do that over. So
Okay, it's D-Jar. It's like just think about like D-Jar is open.
okay, DJars, right?
Yeah.
So I know how it is when people like spell my name wrong. I'm like, yo, it's actually EY, not I, or just a Y.
Why?
Cool, cool. So D Jarvis, right?
Jaris.
Jarvis, okay.
D-Jaris.
Yeah,
D-Jaris.
yeah. So she's a member of Forest Black, is currently serving as the senior consultant office of COO, talent and strategy and operations at the Georgia Tech Research Institute. Formerly the senior product manager, working specifically in talent compliance and DEI strategy for Lyft, which is actually where I met you. You did a workshop, and I was like, wow, like you really owned it. And I think I know I'm supposed to be doing an introduction, but the thing I really took from that was like, you really got to own the spaces that you're in. And if your name on it, you want to make it so people don't, forget you. And you made a very like memorable mark on me. I'm like, wow, like I loved your energy. So, but yeah, so is there anything else? Oh, and I gotta mention Hampton grad. So, is there
Hampton. Well, so I'm in my PhD program in Hampton. I'm a grad. I'm an HBCU grad from Johnson C. Smith University, prestigious Johnson C. Smith, and I also have my law degree from Tulane Law School.
cool, great. Was there anything else that I missed?
No, no.
Cool. Um, so I'm gonna start off with like a question I always like asking. I went to a PWI, UNC Chapel Hill, which had somewhat like a HBC experience inside with the Black fraternities.
Mhm.
But what are the things that you think you've gained, and people who go to HBCUs who are Black, like what are some things you gained from it that I would say kind of set you apart from someone like me who's Black but went to a PWI?
So I think one of the first things for me, and I had this conversation with my friends that say like, "Oh, my kids only go to PWIs or HBCUs, vice versa." I think
Yeah.
the first for me was when I walked on JCSU's campus. I, for the first time, got to see Black in a different space, right? Like I got to see the Black trust fund kids, the Black kids of politicians. I got to see, the Black kids that had the traditional stories that we always hear about. But that was the first time I got to see diversity within my Blackness, right? I mean, I met a young lady that could speak Japanese fluently, and I was like, what? So that was the first thing for me, is that I realized that oftentimes when we think about that was the first time I learned that diversity should not be defined by race. It should be defined by perspectives and experiences, right? So that was the first thing. The second thing for me was that it got me so comfortable in my Blackness, right? It got me really, really comfortable in my Blackness. And I think I wouldn't have been able to do that without HBCU. And because I'm from Charleston, I have a very strong accent. Like I got more comfortable talking in like in that space, like in my, natural tongue of a geechie dialect. I got comfortable with, if you're uncomfortable with this, like that's the personal problem. And, then moving to Atlanta didn't make it any better because I see so much Black excellence around me.
Right. Love it. You said something interesting. You was like, this is like one thing I struggled early on in my career. Like, do I put on this proper voice, quote unquote, or do I actually talk like how I want to? Um, and it's like, so my question for you is, how do you figure out that balance? Or
So
even if, is there even a balance? Is there just, you just being who you are?
yeah, I definitely feel like like I don't, my dialect is not as always as heavy, if I'm talking to family and friends. But I think the balance for me is when I realize that, like, as much as we say that the long tones, like, yeah, totally has the connotation of being, like to be perceived as less intelligent, like all those negative connotations to it, that voice is still imminent within the workplace, right? everyone has someone on their team that has worked with someone with that voice, and they do it with comfort. They did do it with ease. And then I started saying like, okay, y'all say like how I talk is aggressive, how I sound it's thick. I'm like, but wait a minute here now. Like we've got actual studies from speech pathologists that have said that this tone that they provide is connected to being oftentimes lack of intelligence, but it's not perceived that way in the workplace. So that's when I started saying like, I'm not about to code switch for nobody, right? I'm going to use the soliloquy that I feel comfortable with. I'm going to say the idioms that we say in our culture, security bag. I'm going to say that in events because I want them to understand that I'm comfortable with who I am in the space that I'm in. And it's, to me, I feel like that's very, very important, especially in this climate that we're moving into. Unfortunately, we really have to be cognizant of how we present ourselves and represent ourselves, so we're not this minute diminishing or kind of like alleviating who we are, right? And I say that to say that where I'm from in Charleston, geechie is a dying dialect, right? And to me, I never want that dialect to die. I'm very proud of who I am. So why would I go in a workplace and try and sound anything other than that? So that's always what's been true to me when I say that, I speak in my natural tongue, as workplace appropriate as possible.
Right. Um, so how do you or just us in general teach the younger generation to be okay with like not having the code switch or
And it's interesting because I used to teach code switching. I used to teach it. And then now I teach it from reverse code switching. And I think for the young people, what I tell them is that, you know, the way how you alleviate negative connotation is through knowledge and expression. So if you're able to articulate this thought clearly, if you're able to, tell the story, then that's all you need, baby. Like you don't have to let them feel however they're gonna feel. Because there's gonna be some spaces I walk in, they're not gonna like it. They're not gonna like the way I talk. They're not gonna like the way I sound. But I'm okay with that because that's not the space for me, right? And I'm not interested in converting into a space to make anybody feel comfortable. Like the first priority of comfortability is me. So I tell young people that I work with is that you have to become comfortable with who you are as a person. You define who that person is that you want to be. You work on polishing it. You work on being better at it. But the first thing is becoming comfortable with who you are in those spaces, so you can be, move high freely in those rooms.
right, right. So what is you said something interesting. What is reverse code switching? I've never heard of that.
So reverse code switching is something that I call is just basically that when you think about when you think about conversations, you hear people when you get the call on the phone, you're like, "Hello, how are you doing?" Right? Reverse code switching would actually just be when you get that call, being like, "Hello, hey, how you doing? What's up?" When you walking at me and they be like, you be like, "Hey y'all, hey, hey, hey," like that's reverse because that's your personality, right? Because if someone came in, they're like, "Hi," that's not you, right? That's why so many black women, especially, they're exhausted after a week of work, because they have been annihilated as to who they are as a person. So they're constantly in this work week being somebody they're not, constantly having a fake smile on, constantly producing this different type of energy. I'm not finna do that. I'm not. I'm not finna do that. I got too many responsibilities in my house where mental health and my ability to show up for my children and my family is necessary. So I'm gonna go to work comfortable, right? Because when I get home, I got to be comfortable for my kids. I got to have that mental health. I don't want to be drained from work and now I'm drained to my kids, right? And my kids have this perception that my mom has prioritized work. So the one thing I can control in my workspace is how I show up and I present myself, right? And it never bothers me. And this is the one thing I always tell people: when you know your stuff, you know your stuff. So it will never bother me if someone says, "Oh, I think she's ghetto. Oh, I don't, she's too urban, she's too this." I could be the most urban, I could be the most ghetto, but I'm going to be the best one at the job at the end of the day. I have the most knowledge about what I do. And I think that's the thing that we have to do, like, we have to continuously remember that if you're the best, you're the best. It don't matter how it come out, how it sounds, how it looks.
Yeah, I love it. It's funny when you said like how you really answer the phone. Uh, I remember I was, and I can talk about this later because I know we're going to talk about negotiating and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Um, and the recruiter called me back, and I had basically asked him to ask for more money, and he was trying to talk me out of it. So he calls me back. I was like, "Hey, you got some good news for me?" So when you said what you said, it made me think about like I was speaking like in my authentic tone.
Mhm.
I also was being very assumptive, using more of assumptive closing, which is like a sales tactic too. So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah. Um, so how long did it take you to get to this point, though?
I would say maybe 2 or 3 years in the working space, right? Because I was working and I just felt like I would get home and I would be so burnt out from all week going, yeah, absolutely, sure. Like, and I'm just like, oh my God, like another meeting. I was dreading going to this meeting. And I was like, look, my next job, I'm gonna let them folks know I'm the Jars DJ James. And so, like, when I remember I was working with a consultant one time, she was like, you either need to be DeJaris or you need to be DJ. I said, no, ma'am. My grandma gave me that name. I'm gonna stand on that name for the to the day I die. I said, but
And no,
nobody's gonna say my name wrong. So I'm gonna give them the opportunity to call me DJ.
I can
Yeah.
hear you. I can it switched to my end. Sorry.
Okay. I'm gonna give you the opportunity to, like, call me DJ. And so, like, after I started going by the Jars DJ James, I think it was irreversible. Like, like it just set a tone. Like, I had my pitch of the jar is open, drop the open. That's my name, the Jaris, but it rings with DJ James too. So, like, when I bottled it up that way, it already let most people, when I came in the door, they're like, okay, this girl has a swag about herself. um,
Yeah.
and so I just roll with the swag.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. It's crazy how people can like give you advice and they have like the best intentions, but it doesn't like necessarily like help you or fulfill you long term. Um, so it's like that's like one thing I've kind of picked up. It's like when I get advice on something, kind of take it like from a grain of salt because it's my lived experience and that person give me advice based on what they
They're
believe would help you reach their goal too, because it's a recruiter. So I know I cut you off, but what were you about to say?
and I said that that's the first thing I always tell people, and that's why I said it when we were talking about, like, the code switching thing, is that when you become comfortable with who you are, advice is nothing more than a tool used to, determine an action, right? That's all it is.
Right.
And with that tool, you decide how you want to use it, right? Some tools in the toolbox, you can only use it on a flathead nail. Some of them you need a Phillips screwdriver. Some of them you need a wrench. So, like, when you realize that you can put that tool in your toolbox to figure out how you can use it on your life, that's the most impactful thing. Because if you are a person, like, they remember back in the day, they used to have that screwdriver, you could flip it, twist it, and you could do everything with it. You don't want to become that person that every time they give you advice, you're turning your head around and now you're a Phillips screwdriver. Now you're turning your head around, you're a flathead. Now you're a wrench. Like, you don't want to be that person. You want to be a solid tool in whatever you are doing and whatever you're demonstrating. But that takes time with you for a long, like, growing and becoming comfortable with, like, who you are and what you do and what you stand for.
Right, right. Um, Gosh, I forgot what I was about to ask. But yeah, so how did you make the switch from? Because I'm looking here at your background, and we spoke previously. You come from like a deep recruiting background. So how did you go from recruiting to doing DEI work?
So because I'm an HBCU graduate, I've always incorporated that within any organization that I've been a part of, right? And so when I started working at PricewaterhouseCooper, I had an interesting incident where we were trying to like get a lot of students hired. We were trying to do a lot of work, and it was to the first time like I was advocating for the student. They're like, "Well, I'm a little bit on the fence because I don't know why this person hasn't done taken the CPA exam, certain things." And so, at that moment, it was a learning experience, right? And I was able to advocate on that candidate's behalf and say, tuition is costly. Like people, everybody doesn't come out and have $1,000 they can put out for a CPA. And so when I said that, I remember my manager messaging me and was like, "Thank you for advocating for that candidate," right? And so when sometimes that got me interested, like, how many partners are so, out of touch, out of mind, like, so I started talking to different partners about, how we can look at resumes a little bit more holistically and not from that traditional eye, right? Because people will say like, "Okay, this person been out of school for 3 years, they should already have their CPA." They might be looking for a company that's going to pay for their CPA. You get what I'm saying? And so we can't hold that against them that they don't have the finances to do that. And so, like I said, it's always been embedded in the work that I did. And so when I got to Lyft, I really had an opportunity to like zone in on the work because of my legal background, like taking it from an OFCCP compliance standpoint and looking at how we are actually assessing our candidates, looking at resumes. And so I think I have a unique lens on DEI. I don't look at it from a race perspective. I look at it from just learning experiences, right? I did a test one time and I won't tell the organization's name, and I highlighted the program of what the program was, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, this is." I was like, "Tell me what school this represents for their engineering program, based off of the course curriculum, and tell me, would this also be a school that you would want to have a student come from?" And they were like, "Michigan, Calgary," because the colors were like a blue and gold color. They were like, "Michigan, Calgary." They were just naming out all of these different schools, and then when I revealed it was North Carolina A&T, it was shocking. They were like, "Wow, I didn't know that much about the program." And I said this is how we begin conversations about hiring, right? Because we can't say that we want to invest in our historically black colleges and universities and just put money at them. We actually have to look at the program and determine like, okay, these programs are providing me or me as a hiring manager with the assets that we need. And so I kind of have always stuck into that space with DEI.
Yeah. So it's like DEI is like a dirty, it's become like a dirty term. And I use dirty loosely because you start to see people are like Elon Musk talks about how DEI should go away, or and I'm paraphrasing here, but then
Mm,
you have Jamie Dimon, who's CEO, I think of what is it? Not Morgan Stanley, but I forgot the JP Morgan Bank.
mhm.
So where do you see DEI 5 to 10 years from now? Do you see it evolving into something else? Like, what are your general thoughts on where you see it going?
So this is my perspective on DEI. I honestly believe that DEI will just have a name change, but the actions will be there because several organizations of these big entities are federally mandated to have certain reporting to yield certain results. And the one thing I want to be very clear about, affirmative action was a case that was brought by two white men. Okay, this was a case that was brought by two white men in regards to Sanford was trying to go back to trying with admissions was trying to go into college. And so what they need to understand is that this is that we're just trying to create equitable opportunities, right? So if a person has the means to do something, that means that they have a better chance. And I'll give you a prime example. I have some peers where their kids in private school, but they're also taking online classes for AP chemistry, right? Those classes are like $1,000 a piece, but they have like this extra support, just all this extra stuff. They got A's in those classes, right? But if you take an AP class, and let's just say you're at a public school and your parent doesn't have the money for the tutor, they don't have the money for the additional resources, and you get a C, right? Imagine what that student who got a C, if they had the resources, what it would have looked like on their transcript if they had the support. So that is what diversity DEI begins with, right? Is that it's equity, it's inclusion, and then it's diversity. But we have become so hung up on color and race and sex that we're missing perspective, right? So the white man that grew up in a trailer park is still diversity, right? Uh, the black girl who went to the private school that ended up going to a HBCU is still diversity, because I'm very sure both of these people have gained different perspectives, and so I think that's where it's going. It's going in a place where the name is just going to change, but this is a touchy subject, but I honestly think what they are trying to do is rewrite history, right? And rewrite history in a way to where it enlightens the atrocities that has happened to African Americans, right? And so that is the big part I think we have to be mindful of to continually to tell our story, because our very great Sojourner Truth said it best. For if we know not where we come from, then we know not where we're going. And so we've constantly found us in that spot of repeating history. And we really have a chance as African Americans this time to, to prevail and yell from the rooftops, the mountaintops,
Right.
what we truly want and need to do as a group of people.
Yeah. When you talk about like understanding the history, so Juneteenth just passed, what,
Mhm.
last week, I believe, uh,
Yeah.
last Wednesday. And I was on YouTube, and I was looking at this news documentary that was like an hour long, and it talked about how the Black Seminoles from Florida went to Oklahoma because they was along the Trail of Tears, and then they moved to northern Mexico,
Hmm.
and actually made an agreement with the Mexican government saying basically if you change your names, and then you uphold our border against the Americans who are trying to basically take you, we'll give you all this free land. And so I never knew that Juneteenth was actually celebrated in Mexico. It's not just celebrated. And then it's also been celebrated, obviously, for like over what the past 150 years in Texas, and particularly Galveston
Yeah.
was where like kind of like the hub of a lot of celebrations going. And so just kind of learning all that was kind of like really crazy to me, because I'm from North Carolina. And so we didn't celebrate Juneteenth in North Carolina. But
Never heard of it, right?
yeah,
Like, and it ties back into the fact of like, there's so much of our story we don't know. There's so much of our story we don't know, and what we do know, we should always be proud of it. So that's why I said, like, taking it back to code switching. I could never, because it's too much. Too many people died on the line just for how they sounded, just for how they looked, for
right.
me to want to emulate the people that they were fighting against every single day. I just couldn't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about it, and I'm like, when I think about back to being like in the sixth grade, seventh grade, there was like this thick social studies book, and they would literally only allocate maybe a page or two to slavery and indentured
Mm.
servants. Like it was just like that was the blend. And then it's crazy, like I've learned more about African history, African American history outside of college and just doing my own learnings, right? Like, we were here in the Americas before the Europeans. Also, some people believe the Asians were here too, the Chinese particularly on the West Coast. But there's pyramids all up and down, right? They,
Right.
they found Egyptian ornaments or hieroglyphs in the Grand Canyon, right? Which is like really crazy. Like how do we not know this, right? And then you look at what's going on in Florida, how they don't want to they call it critical race theory, which is
Yeah.
the rest of the name. It sounds confrontational, right? But like it's really crazy, like you said, once you really learn your history of your people, it's like it takes the world and makes it like four-dimensional instead of us looking at it from two-dimensional, right? So
Yeah, and I think, like you say, it's just us being able to become more cognizant of like what our story really is.
yeah, yeah. Um, so I think you kind of touched on it, but I wanna go through, because we had like a really in-depth conversation about recruiting. I've never been a recruiter, but I have a lot of recruiting friends. So I've heard about you know how the recruiting process go, the importance of understanding those applicant tracking systems, the importance of your personal brand. And luckily, I had I would say a mentor in college that talked about the importance of like LinkedIn, right? And how LinkedIn will be your new resume. And this is back in 2009, right? And I was like, all right, cool. I'll listen to it, and it's just kind of crazy. But at a high level, we can go in depth. But what are some things about the recruiting process that you would say the average candidate doesn't really know or
Um, I said this is gonna be my TED talk, but the average candidate doesn't realize that they're hired in 2 minutes. And why I say that is because uh, we only look at resumes for about 6 to 10 seconds. When you get the recruiter on the phone for the phone screen, in that first 30 seconds, we know whether we're going to move you forward. And then within that first like minute of talking to the hiring manager that first time, he knows whether he wants to hire you, right? Hiring, they don't want you to say this, but hiring is a gut wrenching thing, right? You know, like a lot of people hire from the gut, like, oh, I got a good feeling about this person. But that feeling comes from like how you present yourself. And I think that's the part that people haven't, and I think it's very hard for this Gen Z, like the later generations, because they do struggle with like social, you know, awkwardness, social communication. And so because they're having a hard time with presenting themselves, it's very difficult for hiring managers to buy in anymore because they can't just base it on their gut, right? Now you have to really base it on the resume. Now you really have to look at the projects that they've worked on because they're not coming in there with that bubbly personality or, you know, the different type of swag. You know, they're not giving you that eye contact perhaps. I think that's one of the big things about recruiting that a lot of people don't realize. I think the other portion of it is like people don't always understand the resume that they've written and how important. I mean, it's your resume, so you know, like you should be able to talk to your resume like left, right, eyes closed. And I think that's an area that some people struggle in.
mm, got it, got it. You do you think the social do you because you said that the younger generations are lacking that those core communication skills like eye contact, shaking hands, I guess also understanding how to position your body because body language is important as well.
Mhm.
Um, do you think that's due to our culture being more consumed with our phones and social media? Do you think there's like a correlation between that?
I think it's a small correlation between that and the fact that the classrooms are very much unable. We've come a society, as far as like the U.S. in my opinion, where we conform to the smaller group in a sense. If you catch what that's what I'm saying. So basically, like, oh, the kids, like, you know, kids don't like making eye contact and having a conversation. When we were growing up, that was not even an option, right? If you were afraid to talk to people, your mama made you talk to everybody that walked in the house. She would walk in the grocery store and be like, "Hey, talk to her." You know, like our parents just pushed us, excuse me, in a different way. They just pushed us in a different way. And I think that now that's not something that a lot of parents do. You often hear like, don't let anybody push you. Make sure you feel comfortable. Make sure you, but that's a challenge because in the work world, nobody has to accommodate
Mm-mm.
those small things, right? So I see that often when talking with people, and even when I first started interviewing, like with like Gen Z, I had rejected a few people because I was like, what? You know, like, you know, and then I started seeing a repetition, and then I had to, like I had to do some rework on myself as a recruiter. Like, you know what? Hey, this is a new generation of people, right? I remember I interviewed a girl and she was in her final interview. And the manager was like, you know, like, what are you looking for in your next role? This is what I knew was a game changer for us. She looked at that man and she said, at 22 years old, she looked at that man and said, she was like, you know, my well being and peace is what I'm looking for. You know, and when you think about it, that's a great answer, but that hiring manager had never heard that before. He was like, absolutely not hiring one of those hippies. And you know, we had to like bring them in and let them know like they just their focus is something else. I feel like our focus as far as millennials, and I always get Gen X, I think it is. Um, was, I definitely millennials were more like driven, like, like I'm gonna get the work done, but I'm gonna get the work done fast. I feel like Gen X, they were, I'm gonna make you look good. Like, so we're all, like each generation had their thing that they were known for. This generation is like, look, life is short, tomorrow is not promised. I want to work to live in life, be happy. What's that? Love, happiness. Like what?
Mhm.
Like that's what they go to work for. Like they go to work to support their lifestyle outside of work. They don't go to work to get to the next level. They hope the next level comes, but they want to be able to take their trips and do whatever they want to do.
So you're talking basically about a different set of motivations.
Yeah, definitely a different set of motivations.
Yeah. So what was in this lady's she was 22 and she said she just wants to be like at peace. It's so funny because I'm like I can't imagine that would not have been an answer I would have given at 22. It's just like,
Not in an interview. Like not in an interview.
yeah. So how did you get that hiring manager to change his mind and want to move forward with her?
One of the things I always do with a hiring manager is that I go back to the effort, right? At some point, if we got to the final interview, your gut definitely took you there, right? So we got to lean back on that gut, because sometimes when we lean a little bit too much into our like personal opinions and perspectives of people, that's when you end up hiring the wrong person, right? And
Mm.
so like the young lady had already demonstrated that she had done inside sales before. It was like a sales position. She had done inside sales. She had been exceptionally well at it. She had the drive and she had the motivation to be successful in the role. So I had to remind him of those things, right? And I had to remind him that also be mindful that you're going to have to be a different type of manager to this person. Like, so this hire is not just good for the organization, it's good for you because it's going to grow you as a leader. And so sometimes I think that's a big thing. Like, leaders have to learn that, like if you've been a leader for 15 years, you most likely you've been leading each team the exact same way. So every now and then you're going to have a person that comes and they challenges your leadership style. You don't fire the person and put them on a pip. You just learn, you evolve as a leader to become a leader for that person, because everybody doesn't need the same leader.
Yeah, yeah, and I know from my experience in sales, right? Sales is hard, and like as a sales rep, you don't necessarily want to you don't want to tie your happiness, your personal happiness, whether you close the deal or not, because you're literally going to be a wreck. And so it actually, when she's like my well-being and peace, like if you have, that's one thing that I found with sales reps, the best ones across my career. I've seen a lot of different personality types, some who are more boisterous, some who are more laid back, but they all, one thing have in common, they have a high assurance of themselves and
Mhm.
are willing to walk away from a deal if it doesn't fit. um and so yeah, so that's good for her. Like that's I might have to steal that in the interview. So um so you mentioned about hiring managers, right? And
Mhm.
when recruiters are presenting a potential prospect or potential candidate, right? They're in hoping that the hiring manager would see some potential in this particular candidate. What is the hardest part about being a hiring manager during the interview process? Like, can you walk us through what it's like with a hiring manager, right? They're looking at candidates and then they obviously got their day to day, but what are their typical experience like?
So I think one of the biggest things for hiring managers that they struggle with is the Property Brothers effect, right? Have you ever seen the show Property Brothers?
Uh-uh.
So Property Brothers on HGTV that comes on, these people they say, "Oh, I have a $700,000 budget,"
Oh,
right?
I've heard, I've seen the episode. Now I don't watch it like that, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So they a lot of times with hiring managers, what they have is that they will post a job needing 3 to 5 years of experience, preferred 5 to 8, right? But ideally, they want somebody with 10 years, but they only have the compensation for 3 to 5, right? And so then what happens is they're constantly not, they're feeling like they're not getting the right candidates. one of the things I always tell people, from that I'm like when I'm coaching recruiters on how to be good recruiters is that if you learn your business, and I mean when I say business, I mean the organization you work for and the type of roles that you recruit for. When you learn and understand your business, it makes it very difficult for someone to, how can I put this? It makes it very difficult for the hiring managers to push back, right? And I'll give you a prime example. I was working with an organization and they wanted a electromechanical engineer. And I said, so you want somebody that's going to be more on the EE side than the ME side? And they're like, well, we want somebody that has a little bit of both. And I said, okay, so you want somebody with mechatronics because mechatronics is that new type of degree that's going to, they're like, oh, no, that's too out there. That's too broad. Right. So at that moment, I knew he didn't know what he wanted. Right. So I said, okay, what are they going to be working on? Right. Tell me what they're going to be working on. He said, well, they're going to be working on the circuit boards that go into the system. And then I'm going to need the circuit board, need them to actually understand the amps, all these different things. I said, okay, well, this to me sounds like you need an EE person, right? And I said, but you want somebody that understand the mechanics of how EE works, right? And he was like, yeah. I said, so you need a hardware person. And he was like, yeah. I said, so that's what you need. You need a hardware engineer for this role. And we were able to get to that point because if I had allowed him, he would have ran me through the hole with looking for an EEME person. Then he would have ran me down the MEEE hole, and then he would have ran me down the hardware hole. But then I would have never known. But I had to learn the business and understand, like, okay, what is it that he's actually looking for, and do some research on other organizations, on what people are posting these jobs as, and what they're looking for in those roles. And so I think that's one of the things that, um, excuse me, hiring managers oftentimes like struggle with.
Mm. So EEM is electrical engineering, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so you talked a lot about understanding the business as a recruiter. What are some things that you do to actually understand the business better and making sure that you're aligning your recruiting objectives or KPIs to that, whatever those strategic areas for the business are?
So the three areas that I focus on is getting an understanding of the compensation of the groups that I'm going to be hiring for, because I'm very much a peer equitable type recruiter. I want to make sure that I'm not giving more, I'm not giving less, and if there is a disparity, that I can speak to it, right? Because I'm the one who enter in the numbers for what that salary range, that salary should be. That's the first thing. The second thing for me to learn and understand the business is I actually try and learn and become abreast of the product. I'm by with nowhere near an electrical engineer. I've been in the technical recruiting space for like 10 years, but I know it and I can talk to it, right? And so oftentimes when you can talk to something, that gives you a better understanding of like the business. And then the third thing that I always focus on is basically where we are today and where we want to go. So if you have an understanding of that, you can foresee roles that are going to come down the future. And when you can foresee roles, you can see your pipeline. Like, hey, this person isn't a great fit, but I have a controls engineer that's worked on powertrains at this organization before. Let's keep them in the bank, for something else, and then push them along.
Got it. Got it. Um, cool. So we got an understanding of like the hiring manager. And one of the things you said is that a lot of these hiring managers don't know what they're really looking for. Uh, and like when I look at applications, I can like tell whether this whether the hiring manager, whoever's involved, have like thoroughly thought through the job description. Like there's been job descriptions I read, I'm like, yeah, I'm not touching that. Like I've actually I remember like I know for me when I'm applying to different roles, like sales roles, a big red flag for me is if it's like a startup company and they don't have much branding, right? They don't have much customer penetration, but then you read the description of the account executive and they're like, we want you to be able to do this and that. And it's like, but are you spending the marketing dollars to
Mhm.
actually size me up for hitting
Yeah,
this?
for success. Yeah.
Right. And so it's very interesting when you say that because it's like sometimes I look at a job description, I'm like, wow, has this whoever's written this have they actually done sales for a startup or because doing sales at a Series D company is way different from a pre-seed or a Series A, right?
Mm.
Um, so what are some things that, and you kind of touched on it, but what are some things that hiring manager can actually do to be better at hiring the right people, or just making sure that they understand what they're looking for and what the market is actually telling them?
I think this is a tricky question, right? Because if you have the right recruiter and the right HR business partner, and you're not, a jughead, um, you would be successful, right? Because you lean on those two people because that's their level of expertise, right? If I'm building an electric bike, I'm going to rely on the electrical engineers at Lyft to build that bike. But sometimes hiring managers, they have this notion that I know it, I know what I need, I know it, but that's not their area of expertise, right? So relying on recruiters and HR business partners, they have the expertise on one, how to write your job description to attract the right talent, but your HR business partners, they understand what is necessary for you to continuously be successful when you get a hire on. And so I always tell hiring managers, trust the people who were hired to do the job. Like if you're a hiring manager, just be a hiring manager. You don't have to be a recruiter too. You don't have to be the hiring manager, the recruiter, the compensation analysis, the workforce planning. You don't have to be all those people. They have people that have been hired with that level of expertise. Rely on them. And if you feel like you deem them not worthy enough, then that's when it's a different conversation that you need to have with yourself. Like, okay, maybe I need a different recruiter. Maybe I need to be within a different organization. Because I remember I was talking to a manager and we were dealing with compensation, and they were like, well, I don't feel like he should have got that comp, and it shouldn't have happened that way. And I was like, well, I'm not really sure, because they like, well, I want this person, I want to get approval on it. And they're like, well, you're not a part of, you're not a part of the approval chain. That's the first step. And it was a lot of pushback. And he asked me a question, and he was like, what can we do differently in this situation so we wouldn't have it? I said, trust me. I said, because I've hired everyone within your organization, and every one of them have their comp ratio line has been between a 1 and a 1.2, meaning that we haven't gone out of band with anybody. Everybody falls within the same space. I said our team has the most equitable team when it comes down to compensation. So trust that I'm not just giving people numbers to give them numbers, right? And so when I said that, he had to go back, of course, and fact check. And he was like, wow. So sometimes you gotta, as a recruiter, you have to like put on the table, like, hey, this is what I do in my job every single day, because hiring managers don't always understand it. And I always tell recruiters, invite your hiring managers into your space so that they can understand. You don't have to alienate them from what you're doing to what they're doing. No, invite them in. If y'all have a meetings of the minds, like I had a hiring manager, he brought me into the lab. And when he brought me in the lab, I was able to like, when I'm talking to the candidate on telephone, I'm like, okay, well, tell me how many, like with the battery supply life that you've worked with, like, what are you putting those products in? I'm able to now have a different conversation because he invited me in. So after that, I invited him in to see, like, how I scope out the questions. How do I, answer the question? Like, how do I understand the answers that are coming from that question? And so it becomes a two-way street instead of just being two people driving down the lane.
Mm, got it. Yeah, because it's hard when I talk to recruiters, right? Because as a recruiter, you're not. I want to make sure I word this the right way. It's like as a recruiter, you're not directly working on creating a product. You're helping, uh, get talent into the company, right? And I found that for those few recruiters who actually really understand the business, it's like a really different conversation.
It
Um,
is.
it's
So that's
like,
why when you were saying that, I was like, that's my point. Like, I've talked to people on the tech side, and I've asked them questions, and they're like, whoa, I've never had this question come from a recruiter before. Right.
mm,
So they weren't prepared to have that type of conversation with me. Right. But this is how you are able to really speak to the business. And that's why I always tell new recruiters that are wanting to get into it, if you are hiring a sales job, you should be able to walk in front of an organization and talk about that job, talk about what that day is going to be like. You should be able to talk about it like you're a person that does it, right? You should have that much of an understanding. Now, do you have the capable? Now, do I have the capabilities to go and put a electric bike, electric scooter together at Lyft? No, but I had a solid understanding of what that work was going to look like that they were going to be doing. And so that really, like you said, that changes the conversation that you have with the candidate. And most importantly, it changes the conversation that you have with the manager, because now you can, the manager knows that, okay, when DJ's advocating that this person should be hired, DJ knows doggone well that this is the person that should be hired. You get what I mean?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. And so what you're talking about is how do you basically as a recruiter develop leverage with the hiring manager, right?
mhm,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, so you said mentioned like pay bands. What is pay bands? I think that's very important because it took me. I didn't start hearing about pay bands and stuff in like until like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
pay bands became a really, really big conversation piece. I want to say like 2020, maybe. When Colorado came out with a game changer, like, hey, if this role is, posted in Colorado, or if the role is remote and someone who lives in Colorado can work this position, you have to post the salary ranges for the role, right? So a band is, depending on how the company decides to do it. The band has a min. This is the lowest amount that we'll pay. Mid, which is the middle number, the average of what most people who are in this role are going to make, and then a max, right? And so this band is based off of two things. It's based off of the market, and it's also based off of the business profitability of that organization, right? So one thing that people have to understand when it comes down to a pay band is that, looking at, I'm trying to think of an example. So somewhere like a product manager at a state school or within higher ed state is not going to get the same type of pay as maybe like a startup organization that hasn't gone public yet. That hasn't gone public yet. And the pay of somebody that may be at a larger 500 company like a Coca-Cola, those pay bands are going to look very different,
right.
right? Because the profitability of the organization is very different. So that's the first thing you have to consider when you're considering your organizations and looking at the pay band. The second thing that I always tell people to consider is that the scope of the work, right? That's why job descriptions really need to be written correctly, because if the scope of the work look too much and the band don't match, it's like, okay, this tells me that this hiring manager is looking for somebody with a larger expertise than what they're able to afford. And so I have to make a decision right now, like, hey, am I willing to work for an organization where they're looking for people that is willing to grow? So that's the biggest things with the pay bands, to understand it.
Got it. So you kind of touched on what are things that impact aside from the profitability of the company, but what are some other things that impact the pay band for a person who's interviewing and gets placed for a job? Could be
So
PM.
when you say, as far as like what their final number comes down to, or what that,
Yeah,
um, so I've seen one of the biggest things is how their years are calculated on their resume. So there are some companies, like, like, think about like your hospitals, right? A hospital, you want to put all your work years of experience. You want to put everywhere that you've worked. You want to put all that up there, because
right,
they're calculating all that time, to determine like where you're going to fall at on that salary range. Whereas you may go somewhere where, like a startup organization, if you meet that minimum of 5 years, you're gonna fall into that space. So that's one of the first things, is that, like, to figure out, like, how that time is calculated. And sometimes, like, we've talked about this, but like, push back, right? Because there are times people may say, oh, you only have 4 years of experience. Be like, no, I actually have 6 years of experience at this job. We called it this because we had a proprietary system, but this is a cousin system to X, Y, and Z, right? Um, that's like that is the biggest one that I've seen happen, is that the miscalculation of time. on a resume. And I believe the second one that happens oftentimes, you don't see it too much. It's something called transitional pay inequity, basically meaning that a person will come in, they're not being paid fairly at their last organization, right? And we already know the average person, when they go to the next job, studies show that they only ask for 10 to 15 thousand more dollars. So let's just say you're already underpaid and you ask for 10 to 15 thousand more dollars, right? Your 10 to 15 thousand dollars may put you at the minimum, right? And when it puts you at that minimum amount, you never make it to the mid range. So I always tell people one of the safest ways to have this conversation about compensation is that, hey, like I'm interested in learning a little bit, because the recruiters, like you said, they don't always know the ins and outs of the position. So, hey, I'm very interested in the opportunity. It sounds really good to me. I just want to have a little bit more conversations with the hiring manager before I set a number. Can you share the range with me? Right. So then it puts the ball in their court. Don't say that you're open to negotiations, because they're going to press you for a number. But like, hey, put the ball back in their court. Can I share the range? There's nothing legally that says they cannot share the range. If they choose not to share the range, then you as a person have to make the decision. Like, do I decide to stay with this company? Do I not decide to stay with this organization?
Mm, mm. I like that. Yeah. Put on, because I've been asked that too. And I've been asked it a lot. And typically what I do when I answer that question, I just try to give a high number. Like I want to give a number to the recruiter where it pulls out a real answer from them. Right. Um, how would you
Well,
gauge?
that's a dangerous territory, because there are some recruiters that are very old school and traditional in the mindset of like, if he shouts out a number that's too high, we're gonna reject him. If he tells us that he's looking for 150 and we only pay up to 110, and when I tell him 110, he's like, "Oh, I can make that work." I'm not going to move you forward, because what if I have three other people that I'm talking to right now, and they told me, one said their number was 80, one told me their number was 95, one told me their number was 115. I already got three strong contenders that are already in my pay range, and I don't want to be in a predicament where I present you to my hiring manager and he really, really likes you, and you told me you were good with 110. Now you're back talking about you want 150. So as a recruiter, you have to make that decision. And most times the recruiter will say, I'm not going to take the risk if I have 2, 3 strong contenders already.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Well, that strategy's changed. Do you believe the pay transparency laws that have been passed in California, and I think New York, do you think they're actually helping pay equity? Do you think it's making pay actually equal for people based on obviously their experience? And I see you lean back though.
So this is my thought. I think it is definitely stirring up the conversation. That's what I will say. It's stirring up the conversation, but a lot of people need to pay attention. There's a caveat in most of those statements, even in the law itself. It basically says that dang, I cannot remember. It says like seniority, tenure. It's a few other things that could alleviate or change. So that still allows room for inequities within compensation. Like if those factors can be played in. So like the pay range is not the holy grail. So like there's still, this is just like what people need to understand is that like they could say this pay range is from 90 to $100,000 and still pay somebody $110,000. There's no law that says that I have to stay within this band. What that pay transparency law tells you is that based off of market research, based off of gender general standardizations of someone in this specific role within our organization that has been profiled to do this specification of work, the pay should be between 90 to $100,000. $100,000. However, should a person interview and be selected for this position that has seniority, that has seniority, tenure, something else, they can receive more than what that compensation band is. And that's an organization who's playing the game correctly and putting a real range. Now, these companies I see that do 80,000 to 200,000, like, no, I don't think that's not a range. That's not a range. That's not a band. Like the purpose of pay transparency is to get an idea of like a scope of the position. Like That's just such a far gap.
Mm, okay. Um, so when someone's negotiating their compensation, what are some things that people tactically should do? Like you mentioned one, obviously, where you ask for what's the budget for this role, but what are some like other tactics that people can use just to make sure they're getting the best deal for them based on their experience, their location, and all that and stuff. So,
I always tell people one of the biggest things you can do is present data, right? It's hard to argue with data versus emotion. Like when you say, I feel based off of my experience that I should get this, feelings ain't never did nothing for nobody but just give you a good feel or a bad feel. So when you come to somebody and you tell a recruiter like, "Hey, I'm very interested in the opportunity, but just to make sure that everybody that my resume was reviewed correctly or to make sure that I'm being assessed properly, I do have 10, do have 15 years of talent acquisition experience, along with my years of experience in that specific field. I have X amount of years working on special projects, da da da." Then lay the land of like, I also bring not only the practical knowledge through my years of experience, I do have theoretical knowledge with both a bachelor's and master's or doctorates in that area. And with all of those combined, I do appreciate the offer that you provided me, but I do believe that my offer should sit at this amount, right? So when you come back like that, one that takes a recruiter like, look, we got to come back with a real offer. Like you can't come back with a few hundred, like it makes them say like, okay, this person knows their worth. Everything that I always tell people, it always goes back to understanding who you are and what you're worth. And I say this because one of my good friends to this day, Alicia, she gave me the best advice. She owns her own tax business, a boutique, financial services. And the advice that she gave me, I was down on my luck. I was trying to find a job. And I was like, I'm just going to take a job that pays me like $20, $25 an hour. And she was like, girl, no. She was like, know your worth. And the way she said it, I was offended. I was like, what? But I need the job. And when I reflect on it in now, and we always laugh about when we talk, is that when she was telling me know my worth, it was basically like my worth is not just the estimate of my bills, right? My worth expands further than that. And so ever since she told me that, I've always moved forward. Like, okay, I'm not worried about you can't just pay me enough to manage my household. You have to pay me enough to because of who I am as a person, like what I'm actually bringing to the table. Because, if you think about African Americans, especially minorities in general, we think about an offer. What do? We sit down and write down all our bills. Like we want to put a little money to the side, we want to take a few trips, and then we'd be like, okay, this will be a good offer for us, right? We never sit down and do research from an aspect of like, man, what are people who have been in this industry 10 years making? What are the VPs making? Like, we don't understand the financial growth gap and the financial, like gains from, joining a new organization. And so when you see the 30-year-olds who are not minorities that are making $130,000, it's not because it's because they're white or anything like that. No, it's because when they came out of school, they were looking for opportunities that were going to put them in a position that said like, okay, you graduated from this school, you have this many years of experience, I'm going to pay you $90,000. Whereas we were taught like, get you a job where you can pay your bills and put a little money to the side and put a
yeah.
little money aside for a rainy day. And so we just learned differently, right? Minorities, we learned about money very, very differently. And so when I tell people thinking about negotiations, what Big Mama taught us, that's the one time I say I got to take whatever my grandma taught me out the back of my head, because it's just a different time now.
hmm Yeah, and you made me think of when I told you about the negotiation that I went through at my previous company, where I was actually transitioned to a product manager role, and I asked for more money, and so I called my mom, and she's like, "You shouldn't have asked for that." She's like, "What if what if what did she say?" She's like, "What if they rescind the offer?" I'm like, "Well, I don't need to work anyway." And
Mm.
so after they ended up meeting me halfway. I think I asked for like 10,000, but they gave me about 5,000 more. And I was like, I should have asked for 15,000 more. She was the first person that I called, and she's like, "Well, I guess you know what you're doing."
I'm
And my
telling you,
mom is a
it's
baby boomers, right? So, um, it was a different time, that they different set of rules than now.
Yeah, very. And I had somebody laughing. I remember when I was working at Sprint, and it was a big thing. They had announced that they were going to be doing 401k matches. I think it was like 100% at 4%, and then 50% at 3% or something like that. So it was going to equate to like 7 or 8% they were matching. And everybody was like, "What? That's crazy! I'm about to put some more money in my 401k." And I was a manager at the time. I was fresh out of college, and I liked working for Sprint. Loved the company, loved everything about it. And so the other manager that was sitting next to me, he was real cool. He came over. He was like, "You seen the email?" And he was like, "How much more you gonna put in your?" And I was like, "I ain't got no 401k." I was like, "I'm gonna just do my 20 years and get my pension." And he was like, yeah, go ahead and put your team in a team meeting and you come in the office, let me show you something. And so I grew up with grandparents who my grandmother worked for the county hospital for her years and she, got her retirement. My granddaddy worked for the waterworks for his years and he got his pension. So like I came from a pension household. So I didn't know no better. I didn't know that like you got to create your own pensions nowadays. So that was very, very interesting.
Yeah, like, and I think that's since we're talking about negotiating and making sure you're getting your compensation. What I found is like just from my experience, and would love to hear your side of it, is like looking at what are the individual things that I'm getting because that essentially could be better than getting higher pay, right? So, more equity. Can I get more equity? Right. I remember when I was at Twilio and I negotiated my offer, um, they weren't willing to give me more equity. They gave me more money. But when I asked for more compensation, I said, "Hey, I'm open to it being higher pay or more equity." Right. And in some companies that are further earlier in their experience, right, maybe they're Series A, they're probably going to be more willing to give you shares, right?
Mm.
Um, and then, like looking at your 401k, my favorite is HSAs. Like I think that is like a pure gold mine, right? So, and then I think I calculated at my last company, but I was effectively able to gain another, I would say roughly another 5 to 10% in additional income from maximizing the HSA um contribution. So I think they matched me like 2 to 1 or something like that. Or for every dollar I put in, they would give me two. And then the cell phone bill, stuff like that. But what are some things that you think people should also look at and take into consideration when they're looking at compensation? Because it's just not necessarily what you're taking home. You you have to look at it holistically.
I tell people all the time, one of my golden rules is if they won't give you the money, give you the title. A job title will take you where money will not every single time. If they don't want to give you they want to work you like a director. They don't want to pay you like a director, but they want to have you in the title of a lead or supervisor. Negotiate your job title. They say they don't have no money, negotiate your job title. That is the best thing you can do for yourself is to negotiate your job title because as a recruiter who looks at a resume for 6 seconds, the first thing we see is the job title,
Yeah.
right? And so that tells us right there what that first step is, right? So negotiating the job title is one. Also, one thing I always tell people to be mindful of when they're thinking about their compensation is that there's a calculator out there that takes you can calculate what your taxes are that will be taken out, but also look at the benefits, right? Get that benefits package because like there's some places where by the time you take your pay your insurance is $700 that you're going to be paying in insurance. So get that and have an understanding about that. And then last but not least, negotiate back to peace and wellness. Negotiate your PTO, right? That PTO is still money in the long run because that is time that you're able to take off to do whatever you need to do. So just look at it in different ways that you can negotiate to determine like how those pay cycles actually can work out for you. But I think rule number one is always when they hardball you like we don't have the money. Okay, that's perfectly fine. Let's talk about the job title. Can you give me the can this be my job title?
Mm. Got it. Got it. I think you said that too when we was discussing. I gotta ask an obvious question. Why, and you touched on it, but why is your title so important to your future income growth?
I think one of the biggest things, like I said, is that one, um, recruiters don't have a lot of time to look at resumes.
Right.
So while the bullets that you have up there, they're very sound, they're great. But a hiring manager looks more at the bullets. A recruiter looks at job titles in the first two bullets, right? To see what the are you man like what's the title? Was he a director? Okay, yeah, like was he a manager? Okay, all right. Was he managing a team? Let me see if he was managing a team. Okay, he got up here that he was managing a team. Oh, okay, he's been managing a team for 5 years. This is this job. Okay, what type of products has he worked on? Okay, he's used these systems. Okay, this person is a yes, move them forward. So imagine if it's time for you. You've been in this industry for 10 years. Like you've been recruited for 10 years and you've been accepting senior recruiter for 10 years, but you've managed a team, you've led projects, you've led implementation, you've done all these things. And unless you're able to talk to that hiring manager directly, the recruiter may not witness all that in your resume if all they see is senior recruiter. Because all they're gonna see is senior recruiter, senior recruiter. Okay, all right, this person's not a fit.
Mm,
And while I do believe that's something we have to do better as recruiters, but that's just the reality of it, right? And then another thing is that when we have our intake calls with hiring managers, a lot of times, like, okay, what are some of the job titles or the positions that we should be on the lookout for? They tell us, like, hey, this person might show up as this, they may show up as that. And so when we have a list of alternate job titles that they can show up as, and we have our job title that is showing up as, and you're not showing up in any of those buckets, sometimes you can get moved. Now, I'm a recruiter. I'm not gonna say I do it all the time, but sometimes I pick up the telephone and talk to these people to get a better understanding. Like, hey, I see you've been a senior recruiter for the past 10 years. Have you managed teams? Because logically, to me, I would feel like, hey, this is something you've done.
right.
But if you're a junior recruiter with a type of role and you got a hiring manager that's hounding you, you're gonna try and produce the best results.
Mm. You what was I about to ask? Oh yeah, so should a how often should a candidate go back and forth in the renegotiating with a recruiter? Right? Should they just make one counter offer? Should it be two? Like what does that look like from a recruiter perspective?
I'm gonna tell you, I'm a very black mom recruiter. Okay, I'm not gonna do this back and forth with you all day. We're gonna negotiate. You're gonna tell me what you want. Is this what you're really looking for? Because we're not gonna do this back and forth now. So I don't do a whole lot of back and forth with a candidate when it comes down to recruiting, me personally. But if you ask for something and they give it to you, it's done. It's done. Don't do that. But if you ask for something and they don't give it to you and they don't meet you at 50%, I would go back. I would go back. If you ask for 10,000 more and they only give you $2,000, in that situation, I would kind of be like, hey, like this is what I'm really looking for. Please give me your best and final offer. So I let them know. See, I think one of the biggest things people have to understand is that like you got to give verbiage to let them know you're not interested in playing around. So like if you tell them like, hey, this is what I'm actually looking for. I want the 10,000. You gave me two. Let's meet in the middle and you give me six, right? If you cannot meet the six, can you please meet me with your best and final offer? Please review below again my credentials as I'm very ecstatic to join this organization. When I show you my credentials and you come back, at that moment you have to decide because I mean I've heard some people say they did negotiations like 4 times back to back, and it's like no, I'm not, because I'm one of those people like when people ask me for something, I let them know right there because I understand the compensation of the role. So I know off top if they say like, hey, I'm looking for 170. I don't do the stall game like, oh, let me take it back and see what we can do. I tell them right there like, hey, 170 is not possible. So if this is if this is the make or break, just let me know right now because I know 170 is not possible at all.
Mm.
But I definitely know there's some wiggle room that we do have that we can go back a little bit forward with. But I'm not gonna come back with 170 at all. Okay. And then it's like, and when you end it with like, okay, they're like, all right, I definitely understand. Let me see what that number is gonna be, and we go from there. Okay, most definitely. And
Yeah.
I come back to the hiring manager and say, hey, he kind of offered. This is the offer, but Be prepared that this candidate may walk away. We had this role open for 6 months. Do you want to go ahead and write an exception so we can get the 170 for this person, or do you believe they'll take this amount, right? And then when you go to that route, and it's like, oh, this role been open 7, 8 to 9 months, because I give them data too. Like, hey, this person want 170. I'm gonna shoot my shot doing 165 or whatever it is. But you have to remember, if this person walks away, this role was open for a year. You done did 40 interviews now. So I don't want to hear nothing from you either. So negotiations for me is very much I put on my black mother hat very proudly with the hiring manager and the candidate.
Yeah, yeah. And that's funny. And I noticed that your true self came out too when you're doing this talking. Like, look, this ain't gonna work, honey. Like, um, yeah. So like when and that's one thing that I like to do when I renegotiate an offer. I first like to emphasize or show why I'm really interested in this company, right? And one of the things when I'm looking at companies, I look at it from an investor standpoint because I invest in the stock market and stuff, right? And so I'll say, you all, based on what I've seen or what you told me, you all are running a 30% gross margin as a company. And most of these tech companies in this high interest rate environment aren't doing that. Right. And
Mhm.
I'll kind of pepper that in. And on top of that, this is a company I want to be here for 3, 5 years, whatever that number is. This is
Yeah.
why I want to renegotiate. Um, and the one thing I can't remember who told me this, but the way that a company negotiates an offer is the way that your working relationship will be with them, right? And like I feel like a good negotiations, each person should feel like they left something, on the table, right? So even when I asked for the 10,000, I knew in the back of my mind I wasn't going to get that 10,000, but I have relatives who are lawyers, and as a lawyer, they always say ask for more than what you want, right? Like you see these civil suits where they're asking for 100 million. They know theoretically they'll probably just get like 10 or 20, but they gotta
Yeah.
go crazy with it. Um, but yeah, so have you ever, or even like a hiring manager, have you ever had a candidate where they just negotiated so bad and it felt like they didn't respect you to where the offer was rescinded? Have you ever experienced that?
Where they rescinded, they rescinded the offer.
Yeah, when you was going back and forth with a candidate, and you got the candidate what they asked for, but then the candidate was like, "Oh, I want something different." Like, have you actually seen the hiring manager get rubbed the wrong way from a negotiation, or even yourself?
No, because I those no. I think because of my black mama had no. I mean, now I will say one time I had a challenge with somebody, and this was and I don't think they realized I it wasn't a race thing, right? Okay, but it was a race thing because this particular individual, they had a lot of problems about how much money they got. And I said, well, that's very interesting because the other person kind of offered, and I gave him the exact same offer that I gave that person. And I said, that person had only been out of school for like they had their master's degree. They did one of those dual degree programs. I said, so fairly speaking, this person should have no questions asked. I should have got questions about that person. I have had that happen to me before. But again, it goes back to knowing your stuff. Like, because if you know your stuff, like he was the director of engineering, he couldn't push back when I said, "Well, we're still in band." And she was like, "Well, I'm responsible for pay. I'm responsible for this," and I'm like, "That's perfectly fine, but I'm responsible for making sure that the equity happens in this process, right?" Um, so if that's the case, we need to reduce some offers that already been extended then. But I think when it comes down to the money, I don't act like it's my money because it's not my money. That's one of my biggest things, that it's not my money. But I do look at it from a stance of like what is equitable. Like, I was fortunate to be at companies where I could populate the information and see when I put that number in where they would fall, whether they would be out of range. And I tried to stay in a spot where they were, like the saturation was close, where everybody was the same when it came down to compensation.
Got it. And I've actually heard this from a recruiter before, and they told me that they're like, "Hey, we want to put you in the right band because we want you to have potential career advancement. And if we bring you in at the wrong or at a higher pay band, she didn't say this verbatim, but this is how I took it. Then when you are up for promotion, we won't be able to give you additional pay because you came in too high initially. Is that like a real thing, or is that
That's
more,
a very real thing.
or
That's
that's
a
just more
very
like
real
a
thing.
negotiation
That
tactic?
yeah, that is a very real thing. So like the way how the bands work is that like if we bring you too high to the if we bring you too close to the high end of the band, what will then in turn happen is that the hiring manager, when you are up for that promotion cycle, um 9 times out of 10, when you're up for promotion, the first promotion cycle, you're still within your band of promotion, right? So you may not like, like you might not be, it's not a promotion, so it's pay increase, like merit increase. So let me differentiate the word. So it wouldn't be a promotion; it would be a merit increase. Like you've been with the company for 9 months, you're eligible now for performance review for increasing your pay, merit increase. You may not get a merit increase, right? And that will happen because you're so close to what that top number is. They only may can give you $1,000, so you may not see like a large number. Sometimes with the promotion side of things, because a lot of bands overlap, right? So like what is midpoint to max point may be the midpoint for the next level that you're going to. So if you're in that point too much of the overlap, to make sure that that band of other folks that are together are being paid equitably, you may can't get an increase if you are promoted. So that's one thing people don't realize is like a lot of times that those like level 5, level 6, they may overlap. Just they may have some like overlappage a little bit. So you want to be cognizant of that when you're looking at giving compensation. So that's why you will see somebody say, to your point, that like, hey, I'm not able to meet you at 165,000 per year, but I'll blow the water out on an equity for you. You know what I'm saying? I'll blow the water out on, like a, what is it called? Sign on bonus, sign on equity. I build a water out on that because those are things that you won't necessarily have to see, like sign on equity, sign on bonus. You won't have to see that anymore. So like those type of things, kind of like just blow the water out on those, opposed to the compensation range, because you could find yourself in a state of feeling burnt out because you came in so high and you're like, man, I'm doing more work, I'm doing this, but when it thinks about the, again, the pay of the organization, if they made that sacrifice to bring you in, you have to understand the sacrifice you're going to have to take on the back end.
Mm. And you talked about, it was somewhat confusing, but instantly when you said it, I was like, I thought about tax brackets, right? So where I remember my mom, I asked, I'm like, well, if you're making more, will you actually make more? She's like, well, and I'm just throwing numbers. She's like, I would have to actually make 30,000 more for it to actually, for me to feel the impact, because it'll put me in a higher tax bracket. So
Mm-hmm.
even though I'm out of that, I don't know, I'm just throwing a number out. Even though I'm out of the 24% bracket, I'm moving up to 32. I'm at the low end of that new 32. So I'm actually making less than what I was making when I
Yeah.
made less money.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah.
So
Um,
those are all the things you have to think about with compensation, like how the taxes are gonna pay on, I tell people all the time, when we were coming up, $100,000 was a lot of money. It's not a lot anymore with the taxes and the inflation that we're dealing with. So you have to consider your taxes. You have to think about the inflation of costs, and you also have to think about, like, the biggest one I tell people all the time: understand what those benefits are going to cost you before you get into an organization, because that is another one that bites people a lot. It really does.
mm, mm. All right, so I know we're at time. I got one more question. So you're Gullah, you speak Geechee. So tell us about who the Gullah people are. I mean Gullah Gullah Island, Nickelodeon, right? I remember that
So
show.
Gullah Gullah Island is not the Geechee folks. I like to
Yeah,
say
yeah,
that.
but yeah.
So Geechee is a dialect, right? I like to say it is a combinations of broken languages that were infused into one. So you have your people that come from, like, they came from Africa. A lot of them, a lot of the areas that we've seen, like Ivory Coast, like We have a lot of the traditions of them, like especially when it comes down to the food. You have your Bahamian people that have a very like you they go to where they go, where they come, what you say, like it has that tone to it. And then you have just your people that are on the islands now, like James Island, John's Island. So like the Gullah Geechee culture is rich in like the history of the language, but it's also rich in the history of like our wise tales that we tell our children's, like our beliefs that we have. Like it's just like one of those rich cultures of like how we think, how we talk, how we move as a people. It's just it's indebted to the ancestors that was before us.
Mm, And you said it's becoming a dead language, so it's and I think you mentioned you had a nephew or a younger cousin, and you're just like, wow, he or she
Yeah,
does.
like like the kids now, like some of the kids now, especially the ones who don't like live downtown Charleston, they may live like different areas. They don't have it as thick as like when I was coming up. Like it was almost to see a black person in Charleston was automatically like they have that Geechee dialect to them, and you're not seeing it as much. And I can't say as to why because I don't live there anymore, but like I said, I think I do believe it's a dying culture. So much of our history is being erased from people buying up the land, doing things like that. But yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I know we're at time. Was there like anything else you wanted to share? Anything else I can ask that I think I missed?
Only thing I would always add is that as minorities and people of color, I always like to leave a tidbit of like my quote that I live by every single day. It's a retwist of Shirley Chisholm's words. I couldn't ask for a seat at the table because I took the table, and that what that really means is that we as a people, especially minorities, we have to take more tables. And stop asking for so many seats at tables, right? And if we start taking more tables, they'll start having to pull up their chairs to sit with us. So
I love it. I love it. Yeah, create your own table. I think I'm gonna make that the title of this interview. Create your own table. I love that. I love that. Well, DJ, thanks for the time and all the advice. I know, for me as a job seeker and other seekers who are out there in the market, um, a lot of the points you said are very, very good. And one of the things that I wanted you to show us, like, what's the mindset in the day to day looks like for a recruiter and a hiring manager, so that these job seekers don't necessarily see like, oh, this recruiter doesn't like me. Like, no, they have strategies, even a gut that they're trying to
yeah,
satisfy.
and I think one of the biggest things that I think a lot of job seekers have to understand and I empathize with is that we have recruiters that are overwhelmed. They are posting jobs at 4 o'clock on a Monday and coming to work on Tuesday, and they have over 200 applications. There isn't an applicant tracking system out here that has been sophisticated enough to reject a candidate. We have rejection questions that if you answer this question that you don't have this many years of experience, you get a rejection. But believe it or not, recruiters are truly looking at every single resume. There is no, you don't have to put white words on your resume to move it to a top. We do have tools to assess what are good resumes, what are bad resumes, but the average recruiter is, they're using that as a filler tool, but they are still looking at every single resume that comes through. So you just got to be patient, and this is a market where you actually have to begin networking, meeting different people, going to different mixers, and having conversations because you have to advertise yourself a little bit more than what the paper could do back in the day.
Yeah, and one point I want to add too is I went to a workshop. A lady, I think she was like a career coach, understanding how to use AI, but also understanding its limitations, right? Because
Yeah,
a lot of recruiters now are using tools that would tell them whether this resume was AI driven or tweaked, right? And I think she used a percentage, like if your resume is like 90% perfect match um to the job description, that's a red flag that you use the AI tool, right? And
yeah,
it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, is where I've written out stuff and some questions like on a job description, and then I put it in Chat GPT just to see what it says, and I read it, I'm like, man, I do not talk like that. Like, and then I just go back to Grammarly and just edit out the
Yeah,
index of the language to make it sound more English correct. But versus, I don't want to. I put stuff in ChatGPT, and I'm like, I do not talk like that. Like,
yeah, yeah. You gotta be mindful of that.
right, right. All right, DJ, thanks for your time. This was
Absolutely.
thanks y'all for tuning in. This Core Stay Trapping with Trap Talks, where we discuss the intersection of culture and tech. Peace out.
All right. Bye.